Morning, everyone. I said good morning, everyone. Welcome to Triangle Info CCon. Let's give it a hand clap for everybody. Put it on. So, my name, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Devon Carter, and I have the honor of serving as your MC for today. So, I'll be introducing the speakers and trying to keep us out of trouble. All right? What I want to do today or this morning is introduce our wonderful, very, very awesome speaker, Mr. David Kennedy. Mr. David Kennedy is the founder and chief hacking officer at Binary Defense Systems. He's the CEO of Trusted Sec, where he's developed global security strategies. He sets the vision for the company and its future. He is a former chief security officer of Diebold. David is led or has spoken before Congress, shaped security policies, co-authored the penetration testing execution standard, and is renowned for offensive security. He was a Marine with intelligence experience, prioritizes family, fitness, and co-hosts Hacking Your Life podcast. He built a DeLorean in his spare time from Back to the Future, in case you didn't know that. And David's life mission is to help others and to make the world a safer place in cybersecurity, which drives him every single day. I think that is awesome. So I will turn it over to Mr. Kennedy. Let's give him a round of applause and welcome him. Thank you, man.
Absolutely. Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks so much for coming to hear me talk today. The DeLorean story is an interesting one, really quick. It's actually what got me into cybersecurity. Back to the Future 2, when it first came out, they go into the future. I think it was, 2015. And the promise of technology and how it was going to impact our lives really got me homed in on cybersecurity. And I remember at the time, I came from a lower class type of family. My parents moved around, great family, but we didn't have a lot of money. And my parents got me a Teddy Ruxpin for my birthday. And if you know anything about Teddy Ruxpins, they're amazing. Those are the most amazing things that ever came out. The first day I got it, I tore the whole thing apart to figure out how it worked. And my parents were super mad at me. And then that kind of kicked off my whole career in cybersecurity. I worked for the military intelligence side. I did 2 tours in Iraq for intelligence-related missions. And then I want to throw a caveat on there for Diebold. I came in to Diebold after the voting machine issues, by the way. So that's I just want to throw that out there that I built the program after that. So just a quick thing here. But today's talk is an important one. And it's one that I think we've gotten a lot better at over the years. In fact, I think in general, you see that we still struggle with a lot of the same challenges that we have before from the past 20 years or 25 years that I've been in this industry. But we've gotten a lot better at defense. My career has been on the offensive security side of the house, right? I wrote the Social Engineer Toolkit. I wrote the book Metasploit, the Penetration Tester's Guide. I was on the Exploit DB development team, Kali Linux, Backtrack, all that other stuff. And my whole career, I remember, 15 years ago, I would go into a customer and we'd be doing a penetration test. And the first day I'd get there, I'd break into everything, and I'd have access to everything, and my job would basically be over at that day because I already owned everything on the system. So I'd spend the next 2 weeks writing cool tools or testing and prod new exploits, things like that. And eventually went more into the leadership role. And what's interesting about today is that it's substantially more difficult across the board to break into organizations as an attacker. Defense has gotten a lot better. However, we still run into a lot of the same pitfalls that we have from the past. A lot of the basics are kicking our butts. Our security programs that take a long time to develop don't move fast enough. I'm sure none of us are involved in meetings every single day. That consumes most of our time. I'm sure our folks that work for us aren't consumed with meetings either. I'm sure we have unlimited funding and budget. I always make the joke, it's kind of a joke, it's kind of not, about I could fix cybersecurity today. I have the solution for cybersecurity today, which is if we could hire 1 security person for every 1 employee, we'd be fine, right? Security would be fixed. Because we could literally sit behind Bob and be like, Bob, don't click that. Bob clicked it. Okay, grab his box, send it to the person next to him, re-image it, everything would be good to go. But we don't have that luxury. So we have a lot of things that we have to do to meet the demands. And plus with how technology progresses, every new buzzword that comes out is now something that we're integrating. If you look at AI and ML, it's the word that we're getting literally air horns sent to our direction every single day. We have to move at a rapid rate, and I feel like we had kind of a golden era in cybersecurity around the waterfall type production instances where you'd have code that would be frozen, and then you could actually inspect it and do code analysis and find your defects, and then you release it to prod. And we actually had a pretty good time frame where web applications weren't the predominant way of getting attacked because we had these good controls into place. And then we went to agile workflow, which now things are moved into production 10 times a day. We're hoping that we have enough CI/CD pipelines to be able to check those vulnerabilities, and sometimes we retroactively go back and do it. But we have to move the same way as the business itself. And so today's talk's really going to be about how do we look at the risks that we have in our organizations, and how do we move fast in certain areas that we absolutely can move fast in, and how do we communicate that process to our organization or our business. I did a great job with the background, but just a brief introduction to myself. I started TrustedSec, I think 2012. From the basement of my house, I had, I think, 4 months of rent in the bank. I was the chief security officer for Diebold. And this is a great story because my wife had just had twins, and I decided, hey, it's a great time to start a business, right? Hey, put the whole family at risk and start a business in the basement of her house. Sounds great. And my wife was super supportive, and we started TrustedSec, and then I started Binary Defense after that. And we have over 350 employees worldwide now, which one of the best decisions I made. But I look back at young Dave, and I'm like, man, you were crazy. Like, what were you thinking? Like, I would never do that now. So I was very fortunate to be able to do that. And that's our headquarters in Brighton Sunny. It's not Brighton Sunny, Fairlawn, Ohio. So, and that's the DeLorean, by the way. I had to throw a picture in there. It's fully converted to the Back to the Future machine. So it has the flux capacitor. It shoots fog out the back of it. I did all the programming, logistics on it, and everything. If you don't know anything about DeLoreans, they're horrible cars. They're like some of the worst cars that have ever been made. So basically it's a brand new car. I had to put a whole new chassis in it, a whole new engine, new braking system, all new electrical. So basically it's not really a DeLorean anymore. It's like a modernized DeLorean. It doesn't do time travel yet. I'm still working on it. But everything else works. And interesting enough, if you ever come to TrustedSec in Fairlawn, since I'm a huge Back to the Future fan, I have some of the original props from the movie. So I have the original hoverboard that was used in the movie. I have the almanac that was used in the movie from Michael J. Fox, and a few other tidbits there as well. So anyways, big computer nerd and this. So today, the challenge is that if you look at just historically the data breaches that we see for most organizations, and I have a couple really good examples here of organizations that have amazing security programs, but they still fall to some of the most simplistic attacks that we have out there. And so why is that? Why are we experiencing large data breaches that go undiscovered for large periods of time? And the longer that the attackers are in our environment, the longer the breaches are. Why do we have those things continuously happening today? And how do we move faster in our programs? Now, there's a difference between our 3-year programs and how long those take to implement, right? Has anybody ever tried to implement allow listing or application control in their environment? It's not an easy task, is it? It's not something that you can do overnight. It's not something that you can just literally just flip on and put in protect mode and everything's good to go. There's a lot of exceptions. I'm sure everybody has a great configuration management, across the right. Everybody's machines are all the same, the same permission, same everything else. But implementing things take a long time, and changing how an organization works takes a long time, and communicating security to all of those businesses take a long time. When I was the chief security officer for Diebold, the biggest thing that I focused on first and foremost wasn't vulnerability management, wasn't my governance program. It was making friends. It was making sure that the different teams had trust in us and what we were doing. And I'd buy the IT folks like beer and pizza and all this other stuff just to kind of win them over. Lots of beer after I broke a bunch of stuff, but that's another story. But when you look at what we're trying to focus on, it's really making sure the business understands what the risks are to the organization, what we can do to help alleviate them or address them, or at least communicate them in a way that they understand, hey, this is a risk or it's not a risk. And with technology moving as fast as it does, new initiatives, everything else, it's never been more, I would say, harder for us to actually implement it than ever before. And if you look at this, is one of my good friends, Kevin Minnick. He unfortunately passed away last year from pancreatic cancer, but Kevin was one of my mentors growing up in the industry and a good friend of mine. And what has changed from 15 years ago to today is that if you look at what hackers were typically doing, if you look like the early hacking groups like LulzSec and Anonymous and those, they were doing it for fun, they were doing it for specific reasons, but it was not necessarily for the monetary gain that you had. Now, I made an amazing prediction. You can call me the InfoSec seer. I said ransomware 15 years ago was going to be a fad, and I was very wrong about that, right? What I didn't realize was how these groups would continuously progress and how much money they were making, invest in their own people, invest in their own technology, invest in their own R&D, and continuously get better with what they do. If you look at the Conti leaks, for example, Conti was one of the largest ransomware groups out there, and it's actually an interesting case if you read a little bit about Conti in this group. They're out of Russia, allegedly. They say they're not from Russia, but then the whole Ukraine conflict kicked off, and they came out with a very pro-Russian stance and basically saying if anybody supports Ukraine, you're against us, and we're going to hack you, we're going to take you down, we're going to shut your systems down. But what they didn't think about was they employed over 150 hackers, and a lot of them were out of Ukraine. And so they ticked off all the Ukrainian employees that they had, and so they started leaking all their Conti data, their internal memos, their documents, their chat logs, everything else, and then the group eventually disbanded after that and went to different groups, but they're making tons and tons and tons of money. If you look at like Alv, for example, one of the largest ransomware groups out there, just this year alone, over $300 million of ransomware payments. That's a lot of money that they're making off of groups and businesses, and they're not really that sophisticated. They're using the same tactics, techniques, and procedures that we've seen for the past 15 or 20 years, but they know when they go into an environment, they research an organization, they understand their security program, they understand what tools and techniques they have, and then they make sure that the capabilities that they have get around those types of preventative mechanisms that they have in place, or the detective mechanisms. So it's a big business right now, and it's only getting more and more challenging, and once one of these groups goes away, another one just goes and takes their place. At Binary, we spent 2.5 years unmasking the Emotet group, and we worked with the FBI, we worked with law enforcement, Europol, and they did 17 consecutive raids against these individual top leaders within Emotet and threw them in jail, right? And so Emotet went away for like 6 months, but then they came back again with brand new leadership, brand new teams, so it's this whack-a-mole process. So we're not gonna be able to solve this from a law enforcement perspective. There are things that we can do with like OFAC, for example, to disallow payments to ransomware groups, things like that through cryptocurrency. But again, I don't think any politician wants to say, hey, private corporations don't have the ability to recover, and now they're going out of business. That'd be a big political blowback, so I don't see that changing anytime soon either. So when you look at today, we have a struggle with the pace of the adversaries, right, and the pace of our security program. I think that's the biggest challenge that we have. We can't implement our 3-year strategy roadmap in 2 days. So how do we augment our security program to move much faster, knowing that it's going to take 3 years to put protective mechanisms in, that we're going to have to communicate that to our board, our executives, our leadership, that it's going to be at least 3 years. Now, by the way, if anybody's ever done a 3-year strategy roadmap, are we done after 3 years? No, it's another 3 years, then it's another 3 years, then it's another 3 years, and our risk is still high in all these other areas, right? Because we have new business units, we have a merger and acquisition, we have new technology we didn't know about, we have these legacy systems that they won't touch because it's going to take $10 million to fix this legacy system when it only generates $2 million worth of revenue. So again, we have all of these challenges that we're never going to actually fix. So I'm here today to say, hey, how can we think a little bit differently about what's actually important and what we can actually do to reduce that risk and communicate that in a way that allows us to move much faster, okay? And so the biggest challenge we have is speed. And if you look at speed, okay, a new attack comes out. There was an attack that we just did a research paper on a new technique. We found a 0-day in Microsoft's infrastructure called ESC15. If you're familiar with certificate authorities, there's like these common methods that attackers will use across an organization when they get initial access into your environment. They'll try to do privilege escalation, right? They'll try to establish a command and control. They'll try to move laterally to other systems. And that's when we start to have a lot of damage, right? The one computer that gets compromised usually isn't a big deal. But when it gets to 50 systems or 100 systems, our server infrastructure, or 10,000 systems, and now we have an event, that's when it becomes a major risk and problem for our company, right? One person in sales isn't the entire downfall of our organization. But if you look at that one specific exploit, we had this in our pocket for 6 months. We compromised 100% of our customers with it without detections whatsoever, and Microsoft went and finally is in the process of fixing it. And so in this specific case, but these attackers that we're seeing today aren't leveraging highly sophisticated attacks. They're not using 0 days that they discover. They're using known techniques and capabilities that are already out there today. But the problem is that they're using legitimate and normal behavior within our organizations. They use the same types of tools that we use for remote administration. A good example, a customer of ours, about a month and a half ago, they use Intune for all their remote assistance, baselining, all that stuff for their endpoints. And we noticed that 2 of their machines had TeamViewer on it. Now, TeamViewer remote, teaming application, but it's a commercial product. It was enterprise licensed. And so why does an entire company who's on Intune have 2 machines that are using TeamViewer? Now, it's not a virus, it's not malware, it's not a attack technique. So your EDRs, your monitoring detection programs, typically aren't going to see it, even though the logs might actually be there. So we investigated and we found that they were social engineered. They called them up on the phone and said, hey, we're the help desk. And with the AI voice modulation software that we have now, you can remove Russian accents. You can sound perfectly great. You can have a Southern accent if you want to, Northern accent, New York accent. So actually, interesting enough, statistically, there was a study that they did on social engineering and accents, and Southern accents have a much higher probability of conning somebody on the phone versus somebody with a New York accent, believe it or not. So I guess we're not trustworthy of or trusting of New York accents for some reason. More persistent. I think that's why it's more persistent. Southern accents more nicer, friendlier. I guess I don't know. Who knows? But you look at that. They had conned them into saying we're the help desk. We need to install some stuff to fix your systems. They wouldn't install TeamViewer. All of a sudden, now these attackers had access to their environment. Again, things that we wouldn't necessarily see in our traditional security program. And so when you look at how we communicate these risks, I'm a big fan of talking to board members and executives as humans, not necessarily a direct, and don't get me wrong, taking your security program and modeling it off of ISO or NIST or using CMM or anything like that are all great things to align your program with and where you're going. But at the end of the day, they want to know what's actually happening out there and what's occurring and what you're doing to protect against it. And that's why I really like making things real. So when I'm communicating to a board, a lot of times I'm talking more so about what the threat models are to their organization, the adversaries that want to target them, whether it's ransomware, if we're in DoD or scientific, research, China from an APT group perspective. Who are the actual adversaries that want to target us, and what are our capabilities to actually defend against them? I remember one time, before I go to that, I was in a board meeting for Diebold, and I like to do a little bit of humor in my communications with folks. I just can't go up there and just be dry and not have a lot of fun with it. And so it was during the time of the Stanley Cup. Big, obviously Canada, very big on hockey. And if you looked at, we had at the time ArcSight, and we had these things called dynamic lists, which was just a pretty pew-pew map that would show where all of our attacks were originating from. And you could see all these attacks coming from all across the globe, United States, China, Russia, whatever. And then you saw 0 attacks come from Canada that week where the Stanley Cup was happening, right? So it was a good joke. They remember, they still talk about it every so often, which is great when we talk to those folks. But I want to pose a question today. Is security actually working? And the reason why I posed this question, I'm going to show you a quick video that I just did recently on CNBC where I talked about all the latest attacks. And the news anchor kind of threw me a zinger. She said, David, is cybersecurity actually working? Because we're seeing all these breaches happen. I was like, whoa, that's a loaded question right there. But if she's asking that question, it's not just her, it's the public opinion of seeing all of these different breaches occur. What are we doing to actually protect these organizations from the compromise? So that's kind of the stigma we have, right? And I'll tell you another really quick funny story about doing interviews. I did an interview. This was about 2 years ago, and the reason I bring it up is because it happened again to me about 2 weeks ago with the Israeli pager stuff. When you go on the news, so I do Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, BBC, you name them all, I'm usually on there talking about cybersecurity stuff. And you usually have an idea what the topic's gonna be, but you don't know the question. So they can ask you crazy questions. Like I got asked one time, like, Dave, how would an electromagnetic pulse or EMP impact? I'm like, I don't know anything about EMPs. Like, what am I supposed to talk about? Like, I don't know anything about EMPs. Like, yeah, it would shut down all the IT infrastructure, I guess. But one time I got introduced, and this was during the heightened Iranian conflict stuff that was going on, and they wanted to bring me in as an Iranian cyber expert to talk about the capabilities of Iran. And so I was like, no problem, it's easy peasy, I know all about Iran. And so it was a joint segment where you have someone kind of go on first and then you go on second. Well, the first person was an Iranian nuclear expert, okay? And I know nothing about nuclear programs. I know nothing about Iranian nuclear programs, anything about nuclear. I saw, Oppenheimer, that's about as good as I got, that's it. And they got the segments mixed up and they introduced me as the Iranian nuclear expert. Now, you have 2 choices at that point in time, right? You're on live TV in front of millions of people. This is like one of the primetime shows. And I have a choice, like, do I correct them and tell them, hey, I'm not the Iranian nuclear expert, I'm a cyber expert, or do you panic and pretend to be an Iranian nuclear expert? And I panicked and pretended to be an Iranian nuclear expert. It's one of the worst segments ever. By the way, I don't sweat. I don't get nervous on TV, and I was sweating like under my nose. I didn't know you could sweat under your eyes. Like my whole suit was drenched. I was drenched in sweat within like a 2-minute segment. And so like, yeah, the treaty of 1983, the Iranian nuclear treaty of 1983. I'm like, yeah, I don't know anything about that, like, oh no. So I'm like, yeah, then I tried moving it more towards cyber. I'm like, hey, we should, like what's interesting about the Iranian nuclear stuff too is they have this amazing cyber program that's hacking it. It's like, oh no, we have an expert coming in next to talk about the cyber stuff. I'm like, that's me. So like, it was bad. But again, it happened. So I learned from my mistakes, by the way. So 2 weeks ago, I was on one of the news organizations, and they introduced me as a C4 explosives expert. I got the segments mixed up, and I'm not a C4 explosives expert. Don't know anything about explosives. And so I was like, no, I'm actually the cyber person. So let's talk about cyber. And it actually rolled really well. So, when you're under those situations, if you get called out for being an expert or not, try to actually navigate them more towards what you're talking about. So I'll go ahead and play this clip really quick. And this was talking about all the different hacks that we saw. So we saw United Health, MGM, Caesars, Snowflake, a bunch of others that have been experiencing large data breaches. And one of my favorite breaches that I'm going to talk about is Uber. The hack for Uber is one of my favorite use cases about how a security program can fail at every single aspect, but you have a good security program. It's good learning lessons for us, right? You look at history, you look at what we can do now, we can change this a little bit. So it's a quick segment, and you'll hear her ask me, is cybersecurity working? And I thought it did pretty well.
Indeed, in recent months, a barrage of cyber attacks have plagued companies, with hackers breaking into the digital vaults of United Health Group, the auction house Christie's, and MGM in Vegas. In each case, the hackers demand big ransoms or threaten to inflict bigger damage. And on Thursday, as we mentioned, a notorious hacker group called Shiny Hunters claims it breached the data of 560 million Ticketmaster users globally in a recent cyber attack, according to multiple reports. Joining us to talk about that and what's going on more broadly, Dave Kennedy, co-founder and chief hacking officer of Binary Defense. Dave, it's good to see you again. And do they just keep getting bigger? What's going on here?
Well, I think you're seeing a lot of success with these ransomware groups. You look a few years ago and they were maybe getting 100,000, 200,000 type of payouts, and they've moved to much larger organizations like you saw United, MGM, Caesars, and the payouts are astronomical. Elfi, one of the largest groups, reportedly out of Russia, is estimated to have over $300 million in ransomware payments alone. So they're making a ton of money going after larger organizations, and that money then is put into more sophisticated attacks. They build better weapons to attack these organizations and companies. They're more efficient in what they do. They get affiliates that help them go after these big companies. So it's just scaling. It's essentially a whole nother business revenue model, for these organized crime groups, and they're going after some of the largest companies in the world now because they're having that much success.
If you were consulting, as I assume you do, to some of these big companies, and a company, let's say United Health, is subject to an attack, or Ticketmaster or whomever, and they face ransomware, what would you tell them to do? Pay it?
It's such a tough decision when you're in these organizations. I mean, some of them, if they don't pay it, they're completely going out of business. I mean, I've been in meetings before where I've had the CEO break down, cry because they have to pay a ransom because their business is literally going to go out of business if they don't. In other cases, you may be able to actually recover, and it's a painful process during that period of time. You look at what MGM was able to do. They experienced over $110 million worth of damage, but did not pay the ransom, whereas Caesars paid, $15 million for the ransom because it was the easiest way to recover. My advice is, based on the situation, is always to not pay the ransom if at all possible. But again, if the business can't operate, they're going to go out of business if they don't. Sometimes the only option is, unfortunately, to pay the ransom.
Does this mean that cybersecurity is not working? What do we know about the cyber defenses that each of these companies have had in place prior to the event?
Listen, these companies have full-fledged cybersecurity programs, but the issue that you run into is scale. The larger you are as an organization, the larger your attack surface becomes, more ports and protocols and things, and more services that you use from third parties, cloud providers, which creates these opportunities for these attacks to be successful. It really only takes, one user, for example. If you look at the case of MGM, they're able to use essentially AI voice modulation to remove Russian accents, call up the help desk and then, impersonate somebody. These are, sophisticated attacks, yet very difficult to protect against. It's not that cybersecurity isn't working. It's just the scale of these organizations and companies and how they're kind of modeling how they look at their organization's growth and capacity. Technology increases complexity within an organization. If they don't have a solid security program based on its foundations, it gets very difficult and challenging for these organizations to really scale their cybersecurity programs, let alone their technology footprint.
So I like to use this one as an example. So this is Uber, and it's one of my favorite ones to use because I know a lot of folks that work at Uber. They have a full-fledged cybersecurity program. They have, countless folks that are dedicated to protecting it. They do source code analysis. They do application testing. They have a monitoring detection program. They have vulnerability management. They have a governance program. They meet their compliance and regulatory requirements. And yet they had a massive data breach. And when we talk about Uber, I mean, they didn't just own like little parts of Uber's infrastructure. They owned everything. They had access to their source code. They had root on their AWS infrastructure. They had access to literally every aspect of Uber's network. Every single aspect of Uber's network, completely owned inside and out. And it was done by a bunch of 16-year-old kids out of the UK. 16-year-old kids, it was like 3 of them. So how do we have this big of a failure for things that we preach today as our foundational programs that we have out there? Well, let's look at how the actual attack occurred. First of all, these kids, so there's different groups that are out there, right? You have groups that are just like low bar doing business email compromises. What's actually interesting about business email compromises, by the way, is BECs have shot up over 200% this year. Why? Because of generative AI. The bar of entry was typically having a native English speaker that could communicate with these businesses. But since we have generative AI now, you have now a full-fledged interpreter to be able to create these realistic communications back and forth and interpret it back and forth very easily. So now these really low bar attacks that required at least a little bit of bar entry have become much easier. But you have different groups that have levels of sophistication that are out there that are different. So some of these groups, they just send mass phishing campaigns out trying to harvest usernames and passwords. Then they sell those to other groups. Then you have specialized groups, like for the example of like Dark Matter and those groups that are out there, Black Cat, that's been rebranded a bunch of times. They were involved in the Colonial Pipeline breach. Interesting enough about those groups is that it's usually just 1 or 2 people that are really good at hacking. And so they build, a ransomware as a service infrastructure, and then they farm that out to affiliates that are less sophisticated. So attackers that don't necessarily have the capabilities. And so again, different business models. You have groups that specialize just in, circumventing multi-factor authentication. So these specializations, these low bar ventures have created this ecosystem that we have here today. Now, what's interesting about Lapsus is these kids bought, so they were on this dark web forum, and one of the low bar groups that all they do is they just phish usernames and passwords from organizations. That's all they do. They had a compromised contractor account that they were able to phish. So they had a username and password of a very low privileged contractor, okay? So, but the contractor had VPN access. And so what they did is they bought the credentials for $17, high-end price there, for $17 for an Uber username and password. And then they went to go authenticate to the VPN constructor, these attackers did. And the attacker, Uber had multi-factor authentication enabled. They had push notifications, but it was the push notifications where it's like, hey, do you want to approve or deny, right? Approve or deny. And the contractor got the prompt on his phone saying, are you logging in from Russia right now? Yes or no? And the contractor's like, well, I'm not logging in from Russia right now, and he hits deny. Hey, our security program's working, the education awareness training, everything we've talked about is working perfectly, right? Everything's great, but he didn't report it. Then they did it again. He's like, man, this is annoying. Hits deny. 17 times. They did it 17 times to this contractor. Again, never reported it. What did he do on the 18th time? He's like, this is annoying, and hit approve. Fantastic. Amazing, right? But again, that could happen to any of us. Like, this is not me making fun of Uber at all. This can happen to any one of our security programs out there. We know we have users that would do this in our organization. We know this. There are people out there that would hit approve or deny no matter how much education awareness training we put through their program. They're going to go and hit approve. So now these attackers have access to their VPN, but again, a very low privileged domain user account. Now again, they have a monitoring and detection program. They have all of these things in place. Hopefully they start to detect this, but now we start getting into the insider threat component of this, right? And how effective those are in our environments. And when attackers have access to an already established user account, let's just say they get initial access to a computer, that's when you start to have a little bit of trouble. What they did there is they found a file share from inside the network that had hard-coded credentials. It was a PowerShell script that had hard-coded credentials to their Thycotic password access management server. That was everything. Had access to every single component. And again, they had Thycotic password access. They had a PAM in place for multi-factor authentication, one-time use provisional access for user accounts, especially privileged access accounts. But they had root access to their Thycotic password access management server, so it went all out to hell in a handbasket. So their entire company got compromised from very easily preventable type of things. But again, our security programs in many cases aren't designed for these weird edge cases that we have out there. And you look at other companies too. Has anybody read the report on CISA from Microsoft? If you haven't, my gosh, that was a scathing report. Came out in 2024, and it was specific of a review of a breach that happened at the end of 2022 into 2023. And what had happened was some nation-state attackers from China broke into Microsoft, and they had access to Microsoft's root certificate authority, which allowed them to access any Microsoft 365 customer, anyone they wanted to, didn't matter. And so they allegedly went to about 57 different Microsoft accounts that were specific to this attack. But Microsoft released a blog saying, hey, we detected this and we've prevented it. Well, CISA did a review and said, well, no, you actually had one of your customers report that you were breached because of unusual traffic to their infrastructure, and you still haven't found out how they broke into your infrastructure. That blog's not accurate. So they had to take that blog down, and still to this day, they still don't know how they got access to their root CAs. Still don't know. And then what the CISA report said was Microsoft lacks any fundamental security controls to protect its customers, that they're not even close to any of their competitors like GCP or Amazon or AWS, and that their security programs is basically in complete disarray. And that's where we have most of our infrastructure at right now, isn't it? Interesting. And CISA didn't hold back. This is from CISA's report. You ever want to read this report? It's insane. It's crazy. And that's where we put most of our infrastructure at. So our security program takes a long time, right? And it takes a long time for us to build it. So how do we communicate that our security programs take a long time to fix it? That's what I'm alluding to right here. And it's not technology stopgaps. One of the biggest things that I see most organizations try to do, and this is historical, this has been going on for 24 or 25 years, is that because we have this security program that takes 3 years, but really it's 3 years, 3 more years, 3 more years, 3 more years, we put technology in place to hopefully stop it, whether it's an EDR or a next generation tool or DLP, all these things that are supposed to help our organizations protect itself while we get the stopgap in place. Here's the thing, if I'm going into an organization, the first thing I do is I go to LinkedIn and I look at what the company has from a technology profile, because I'm sure none of your employees put hey, I am an expert in CrowdStrike, or I'm an expert in SentinelOne, or I'm an expert in this specific SIEM or that, right? So going in, I know what technology you have, and I can also tell, by the way, when you implemented it typically, because it's hey, this person's been here for 10 years and he's 2 years into CrowdStrike, or hey, they're 6 months in, hey, they just did a brand new deployment, this is gonna be easy. And so when we go into organizations, we know the technology that they have, and if you look at Conti, for example, the Conti leaks, they bought security products to ensure that their tools got around the products they were going after. And so when we go into an organization, we know that you have a specific EDR product. Don't get me wrong, CrowdStrike and SentinelOne, and those tools are great visibility tools, they're great products, but if you're using them out of the box because it's that stopgap while you're building all this other stuff, you're in a very bad situation today because attackers recognize that and they know how to get around that going into your environment. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So the way I like to look at cybersecurity and the way that we need to play defense is kind of like a landmine field, okay? Now, if I'm in a wartime situation and I have a blueprint of where every single landmine is, what am I gonna do? I'm gonna walk around the landmine, right? So if I know if I step to the left, I'm gonna blow up. If I walk straight, I'm not gonna blow up. What am I gonna do? I'm gonna walk straight. That's our security programs today as far as attackers are concerned. They get into your environment and they know that, hey, I have this tool and this tool and this tool, and if I walk forward, I'm not gonna see anything, okay? And I move to the left, I'm fine. If I move straight forward, I'm fine. So they stay within the confines of those types of things in our environment because it's right now our security programs in most cases are very commodity centric. They are using off the box shelf tools. So when we look at the landmine field here, our single fastest mechanism to reduce risk and to move faster is visibility into our own environment and making things our own. And I'll relay this back to the minefield again. Your organization that you're in right now today is completely unique and different than any other company that's out there because it's different. You have different technology. You have, maybe you're a 50-year-old company versus a 100-year-old company. You have different employees. You have different technology to deploy. You might use a different CRM system. Your organization is completely unique based on the behaviors of what it's taken to build that company over the countless years than anybody else out there. So those behaviors are your strengths. And here's the thing. Visibility into your environment and getting into detections isn't a slow process. Does it require massive change control, go into your change advisory board, your change control board, sweeping changes throughout your new environment to create a detection? It shouldn't. So if we can look at this and say, hey, if we focus a lot of our eggs in our basket right now from a risk perspective on visibility into our environment, and we have folks that are focused on making detections our own, that blueprint that I have as an attacker gets crumpled up into a ball and thrown off the side. Because I don't know if I step forward if I'm going to hit a landmine. If I step to my left, I don't know if I'm going to hit a landmine. Because I don't know. That's the big difference. There was a Twitter debate happening a little while ago. I know that's unusual for Twitter and debates. But it was James Lee, Egypt, was talking to somebody else. And the statement was, it only takes an adversary or an attacker, one machine that the defense didn't know about for that attack to be successful, right? So one user that clicked a link, one box that you forgot a patch on or didn't know that there was a vulnerability or exposure on. And James flipped the script and said, well, no, it's actually the opposite, which is it only takes one detection that the attacker didn't know about to completely shut that attack down from the very beginning. And so if we have visibility into our environments, and that includes cloud, we have a completely different way of looking at protecting our organizations. The two most important roles in information security right now, in cybersecurity, it used to be called InfoSec, now it's cybersecurity, but I'm still using InfoSec, right now is detection engineering and threat hunting. If I had two roles that I could hire in my organization today, it would be a detection engineer and it'd be a threat hunter. Because, and by the way, I would make sure that they're not allowed on meetings. They're not allowed to be in meetings, period. Like, you cannot have a meeting. It'd be in the job description, approved through HR, saying no meetings allowed. And all they do all day long is look through your environment using things like hypothesis-based threat hunting, looking at your environment as a whole, the behaviors that you have, and creating things that are unique to your organization. And if you apply the same principles as agile workflow to our security programs, I know that's a bad word for security, but if you have agile workflow to detection engineering, I'm telling you, your security programs will hit an astronomical rate of being able to detect and respond much more faster than anything else you're doing in your security program, because it takes time again. But a new attack comes out, it should already be in your environment that day. It should be that fast. And having folks dedicated on it, regardless if you have a MSSP or an MDR or anything else, that role should be unique to your organization, no meetings, and focused on moving very fast within your organization. Again, I'll tell you a story real quick. We were targeting doing a red team engagement, and it was for a financial institution that has a really solid security program, probably one of the best security programs I've ever seen. And we found a 0-day in one of the, and they care less about our initial access. They care about, can they detect us in their environment? Because they know that they're going to have a flaw somewhere that's going to allow an attacker into their environment. So we targeted an individual in sales, and the first thing we did was profile their, the first pretext that the attack against them was profiling what software they had installed on their computer. We didn't do any initial we didn't need Trojans or downloads or C2s or anything like that. We just wanted to know what software they had on their stack. So we got the user to basically give us all that information. And so we found a 0-day in one of the pieces of one of the applications that they had, and we launched an attack against them. And we were able to get remote code execution onto their system. Now, we have this internal command and control that we've been developing for a number of years called Scoutmaster, which still to this day has not been detected. So it uses an undocumented deserialization technique in memory to get remote code execution. And we got access to the computer. So we're using like nation state level attacks on this organization because they wanted to emulate that threat. And so nothing should be going off right now. No EDR is going to detect us. Nothing's going to find us because we're using some really awesome stuff, right? A lot of R&D into this. A lot of money spent to get to this point. 7 minutes later, our shell dies. We lose access. 7 minutes. Well, what happened? How is that possible? There's no way that they detected this attack. How did that even happen? So we're thinking, well, maybe it's a bug on our code. So we started working through. We get a call from the customer saying, hey, were you guys on this machine in sales? Like, how did you even detect us? That's unusual. Like, what happened? What they had done, and it's super simple, is they took a list of all of their employees, and they broke them up into two Active Directory groups, technical and non-technical, just based on their role. Okay, so web developer, IT admin, technical group. And then they had non-technical groups, and they said if any non-technical groups are issuing technical commands, then trigger an alarm and let's investigate immediately. Just by us issuing a few technical commands on the machine, busted open an entire massive 0-day attack that would have never been discovered before. Again, that one landmine that we didn't know about completely shut down an amazing attack. It was one of the most righteous attacks we've ever done in the existence of TrustAttack. I was like, this is the best thing. We're all celebrating. Then our shell dies in 7 minutes. We're like crying. It was the worst day ever for us. But those types of things can make a huge difference when it comes to looking at your environment, how fast you can move within your organization, and how you communicate things. So this landmine field now becomes a completely uncharted territory for that attacker. And you start to build those through the different phases. I'm sure everybody's familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK frameworks. If you look at all of the things from initial access to privilege escalation to command and control to lateral movement to exfiltration of data, and you start building your own detections based on your own behaviors in your own organization, and you look for deviations of patterns of behavior in there, I guarantee you today, you're gonna have a lot more success in that than anything else you do that's gonna take 3 years. It's fast, it moves quick, doesn't require change control. Well, maybe a little bit of change control, but not a lot. And it allows you to move much more effectively and rapidly across your board. So important today. So it's important for us to communicate, risk across the board, but short-term things, and what I love from a reporting metrics perspective is, and I think I have a slide in here on this too, if you look at, and no board wants to see like every single technique from the MITRE ATT&CK framework, that's not what I'm saying here, okay, they're gonna gloss over that. But if you say, hey, here's the capabilities that our adversaries have, and here's our coverage and effectiveness against their types of attacks across our environment based on our own, and we've added 15 new detections this month, that's a great story to start communicating with. And shaping your discussions more so around how effective you are at responding when a breach occurs to minimize the damage to the business than about all these programs and how they're gonna shut them down and prevent them, because those are gonna take a long time. We don't know the variables to that. It takes a long time to build these programs. Vulnerability management, to me, is one of the most difficult security programs there is in existence. Like, who owns the middleware tier, the APIs, the third parties, all this other stuff that's out there, like ownership, asset management around that, new systems that are coming aboard, being able to continuously update those, being able to work with every single business. I was in charge of vulnerability management for a number of years, and it was like, that's where I lost all my hair from. Like, it was horrible, right? One of the hardest jobs in the world is vulnerability management, but it takes time to get there, and it's never gonna be perfect in any way, shape, or form. So you look at MITRE ATT&CK, the way I like to categorize this, and I like a framework like MITRE ATT&CK, there's some good things with MITRE ATT&CK, but again, if you just take MITRE ATT&CK as a techniques-based, driven, signature-based detection framework, that's not a great thing, because attackers are gonna circumvent that. It has to be based off of your organization, not necessarily a command that's executed. Hey, if you look at what most attackers are using today for initial access, it's what we call living off the land binaries and scripts, okay? LawBins or LawBAS, or bring your own drivers, BYOD. These are common exploitation techniques where they're using legitimate applications that are installed on your computers that are code signed by Microsoft or a third party or a driver that has a known vulnerability. And they use those to do things like download and execute functionality. Now, there's a whole website called the LawBAS Project, which talks about literally every single one of these that are known, that have been identified. But if you look at some of the common ones that attackers use, RegSVR32, MSHDA, CBD, CSC, MAVinject, RunDLL32, these are things that we should say, hey, in our entire population of user accounts, do we ever have a user that ever executes RegSVR32? The answer is probably gonna be no. Now, if it is, it's probably a very small exception base, and you put an exception in for that, and then you look for deviations of the pattern. If RegSVR32.exe is ever executed in our entire environment, we pop up an alarm that says, hey, something's bad here, right? And there's one thing you can do on top of that, by the way, which I'm a huge fan of, is deception capabilities. Your detection engineers and your threat hunters that you're now gonna go back and try to get budget for, they can also focus on deception capabilities as well. Deception, I'm a huge fan of. It's creating artifacts and data and accounts that are not legitimate, that should never be used in your environment. And if you see them in your environment, you know that there's something wrong. A great example would be creating a login script for all of your users that injects a domain administrator account and password into memory. Now, that password's fake, and you have a domain administrator that matches up to that in your domain that has a different password, and you look for a failed login attempt for that one specific domain administrator account. If I log in as an attacker and I inject in the memory and I look to see what accounts are there, so first thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna use something like Mimikatz to inject in the memory and see what username and passwords are in memory. If I see a domain administrator account and I match that to a domain administrator account across your domain, I'm gonna use that account. And that's a high fidelity, low false positive ratio. You should never see a false positive in your environment, and you're gonna know for a fact that an attacker's on that machine. These are little simple things that we can implement to completely flip the whole script on offensive capabilities today, just by spending a little bit of time. So if you look at some of the most common ones, you have service principal names, or what's called Kerberoasting. Create an SPN account that is never used, has a complex password. If you see that account ever queried, you know for a fact somebody's trying to do an SPN or Kerberos attack in your environment. The certificate abuse authorities, creating a CA that has a specific vulnerability that's not attached to your domain, you know somebody's there. LLMNR, local link multicast name resolution protocol, NetBIOS name services. Broadcasting fake LLMNR and NBNS accounts throughout your network. If you ever see that user account ever using your environment, you know somebody's there. Those are things that mess me up as an attacker. If I go into an environment, first of all, if I go into an environment and for some reason I'm able to detect that they have deception in place, I am like terrified because I don't know what's real and what's not. So I spend six times the amount of time breaking into an organization because I'm terrified that I'm going to trip an alarm. But second, most of the time I can't differentiate between the two, and I'm tripping up alarms as I'm going along. Again, flipping the script, and these are things, again, that aren't massive sweeping changes to our environment, shouldn't require a substantial amount of change control, allow us to be able to be more effective and faster while we build the rest of our security program. And we can communicate that risk to organizations. Here's the progress we're making on our defensive capabilities to respond much more effectively to a breach when it happens. And communicating that to the board, by the way, they recognize that we're not going to be perfect 100% of the time. It's not possible. But if we can shut down that one salesperson from being compromised and it completely saves the rest of the organization, hey, we're in a much better stance than anybody else out there today. We're much better stance than Uber. We're a much better stance than MGM and Caesars. And again, not knocking their programs, but those are things we can do today to stop those attacks. So the big five for me of what our program has to look like is first and foremost is the telemetry data, getting data from a lot of areas. You see Microsoft in September for like 2 weeks lost all the logs. Whoops, whoops a daisy. Yeah, no logs for 2 weeks, cool. But I'll say cloud infrastructure is probably one of our most glaring issues that I see for most organizations. We don't have a lot of good visibility and telemetry into there. And that's an area of concern because where we go out of the past, I get to look at all of our reports that go out to customers. I still read all of them, but I've looked at the past, 15 or 20 reports, and 90% of them is through, our initial access is through cloud infrastructure, right? And then from there, we are able to compromise the rest of the organization because most of the company doesn't have good visibility into the cloud infrastructure. But getting telemetry data and then putting detection engineering on step and making it a very fast, agile workflow process that allows your CI/CDs and everything else to go into there. And by the way, there's so many amazing things you can do with artificial intelligence. Yes, I'm going to use that word for one time only. AI and ML is actually a really amazing thing in your detection engineering strategy. We're running, I think, like 272 supervised training models. And what's great is you can run these analytics of behavior across your environment and say, hey, out of all of our service creations, has this ever been run before in the past 6 months? Well, no. Bubble that up to an analyst and dissect it, bring us back that file, inspect it, reverse engineer it, give us an analysis and a write-up from generative AI of what it's actually doing. One of the coolest techniques that I use for the past 20 years to break into every organization that still works today unless you're using something like AI to interpret what's actually occurring. This is my secret. I'm giving it to you all right now of how I broke into pretty much every company over the past 20 years. Is if I go into an organization, I'm going to go in assuming I'm going to get detected. But what's the story I tell the analyst? Can I tell the analyst that this is a false positive when I get detected? So what I would do is I'd go and I'd download a PowerShell script that has like 3,000 lines of code from Microsoft, right on Microsoft's GitHub site. And I put like a comment code on top. I'd do some research on LinkedIn, and I'd find like their sysadmin or their PowerShell developer. And I put some comment code in there saying, hey, this is used for our DC performance metrics. This is by so-and-so within this, contact me if you need me, here's my email address. In the comment codes in the Microsoft section. And then what I do is like 2,500 lines down in the code, I'd put my malicious code in there. So if the SOC detects that, hey, I'm running this 3,000 line PowerShell script, it's gonna be like, oh, well, it's Bob, he's good to go, he's fine. Or hey, this is a Microsoft script, this is no big deal, it's not malicious. What's interesting about AI is it's not just good at understanding human English or Chinese or Russian or Spanish, it's also good at understanding programming languages as well. And so you can interpret that, and what's interesting about generative AI specifically, and a lot of these security-centric models, is it can say, hey, by the way, this looks like a Microsoft script, but 2,500 lines down in the code, there's this weird block of code that doesn't match this GitHub site, and it's also injecting the memory. It's using obfuscation. It's injecting the kernel through the DLL. We're highly confident this is malicious. A SOC analyst isn't going to do that, but arming the SOC with the ability to interpret that is a great thing that can allow you to investigate things much more effectively and miss things that could potentially be missed. But again, the detection engineering component to me is the most important thing that we lack in most of our companies. And again, like you might have an MDR, an MSSP, whatever. this is still a role that I think you have to have internally at your organization, working in conjunction with those groups to make those detections your own. Because every detection that most of these companies have is across the board of all their customers. CrowdStrike is a great product, but they have to tailor to 100,000 customers. So it's 100,000 customers environments looking for very specific IOCs, looking for previous breach data when these attackers are going off of your own infrastructure. So we have to be able to shift that whole tactic away from them. Doing focused testing to see how well our detections are working and creating new ones in our own environment. And then combing through that with threat hunting to say, hey, have we seen these breaches before in the past? Are there things that we can be doing better? Are there gaps in visibility where we don't have detections for this specific type of attack and getting those back? It's an important one. So I like to say, looking beyond the past, I feel like our industry has been stuck in this like, hey, we have to do these big security programs. And I don't disagree, we have to do those big security programs. But there's things that we can do right now that make a huge difference in how fast we can respond to these specific threats across organizations, our own organizations, deception capabilities, looking at things that move much faster. I mean, we still need to focus on network segmentation and zero trust and all this other stuff, right? It's important, but it's going to take a long time to get there. And I'm sure you're well underway with a lot of these, but we're never going to be satisfied with that 3-year strategy. It's going to be another 3-year strategy, another 3-year strategy. If we can make that one cog, that detection engineering cog and that monitoring detection cog move as fast as humanly possible, I guarantee you it's going to be extremely difficult for an attacker to have a lot of success. Extremely difficult. There are customers that we go into today that we cannot break into, and that's an unusual thing for us. And that's an awesome thing. It's possible. So last part of this is, I've already hit on this a lot, which is moving fast. If you look at how fast we have to move, it's really actually not that fast. It's the ability to be able to build our program up fast in this area so that we can detect things that are happening, again, that are unique to ourselves. And once that's already established, yes, you continuously improve on it, but you already have a bar of entry that's substantially higher than any organization. And these attackers that are coming into our infrastructure are not amazing hackers. They're not. They're what I would consider an average run-of-the-mill hacker. They're not highly sophisticated. They're not using massive 0 days. One of the Conti leaks was my favorite ones. There's always the debate between what's better, Nano or VI from an editor perspective, right, on the Linux side. Nano is obviously way better than VI. But when you look at what the attackers were saying, it was all in Russian, and the translation was loosely, the attacker had broken into this company and got into a Linux machine and was in the VI editor, and he asked the help desk, because they have a help desk to help them out with breaking into companies. He's like, what the hell editor is how the hell do I exit VI? And it was the greatest thing ever, because it's always a joke about how do you exit VI. But you look at what these attackers are doing, they're not crazy sophisticated, but they're taking advantage of how our businesses operate, the tools and techniques that we use to administer our systems, normal user behavior, compromised user accounts. We know all of this already today. How do we flip that script and fast? And my argument today is the detection engineering is where all of that comes into play. As long as we can get that data back centrally in some way, shape, or form and apply our normal day-to-day businesses and look for deviations to those patterns of behavior, we're in a substantially stronger state than we've ever been collectively as an industry. One of my favorite books, by the way, this is the end of my talk here, but one of my favorite books, by the way, is called Rework. It's by the folks that made 37 Signals or Ruby on Rails. It's a leadership book. And I actually read this once a year to remind me of what I need to do to get things done. And this book is about how do you get things done? Like taking what we're taught in our day-to-day lives and flipping it completely on its other side, like meetings. 15-minute meetings with only the people that can actually go and do the work, right? Going into an environment and executing at a high performance rate that allows you to be able to accomplish things that are large tasks that take a long time, but doing them much more effectively and efficiently. So these are the things that I heavily recommend. I recommend this book to read. Last thing is, building security programs are amazing. I'm a huge Doctor Who fan. At the end of the day, we're all stories, but hopefully you make yours a good one. And, with cybersecurity practices and what I've seen from companies, we're getting a lot better in cybersecurity today. We have a long ways to go. And if you look at the shifting tactics of adversaries, we have the tools today to go and do it. It's not going to require some next generation artificial intelligence robot that's going to solve everything for us. We can do that today as long as we can move fast. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.